In this demonstration, I'm going to show how to create an Android application to query a sample project web server. So on the screen at the moment in the emulator, I've got the basic skeleton for what the UI is going to look like. We get the query button so we can query the data, and I can clear the display, which clears this display here. Of course, now all we need to do is make the query actually work. So if I go over to my web browser, we can start off or pick up where the last demo started or ended off. So we've got the demo web server that we're going to interact with. We've already populated some data in it, and we've used a GUID as our app ID. Didn't have to, but we chose to. So when I display all the data, we can see here all of the data that we currently have installed in the server. And what we're going to actually work with is, on the third tab, I can show you from before, we have the XML. So we've got this way of querying, xmlquery.cgi. I can pass it the app ID that I'm working with, shown here. And it's going to return me back a XML formatted set of data. So I can process this by my Android application and have it actually show up here when I click Query Server. Of course, we don't have that up and running yet. So what have we got? Well, let's switch over here to my Android development. So I've got a basic project that I've created already. Here's the UI set up. Interesting things is I've got a button, a couple buttons. Let's see if we can stretch that out. I've created a couple buttons and linked them back to my code already. So here I've got the button for query the server, and I've got the button for clear the display. Each of them is set with an on-click to call back into my main code. And I've also put in a text view, an edit text, which is multi-line, and it's called display data. So if we look at the code that I've already put in, I've got a tag obviously set up so I can do logging. I've got here a on-click handler as again set through the XML just to keep the code here simpler. And I'm going to find the ID for the display data. I'm going to get that view. And then I'm going to change its text to be nothing. So that's my clear display. And for query, I just have this log. So I'm going to display a log, and we can use that. So let's make sure that our logging is currently up and running. So I'm going to select that. And if I go Control F11, it's going to run my project in my, I'll get out of this, in the emulator. And we should see a log message here. That's sort of the first thing when I click on the query display. Or query server, pardon me. And there we have it. So we're live. So now all we need to do is talk to the server. So let's reset the UI here to a bit more space. So now to do this, there's going to be a fair amount of code involved. So the first thing I want to do is I want to be able to set up my application so it can use the internet. So that's going to be in the manifest. I'm going to click on the uses tab, or the permissions tab, add a new, and I want to make sure I click a uses permission. Not a permission, I'm not trying to create one, I'm trying to use one. So use permission. And in the drop down list, I'm going to select the internet. So Android permissions, internet. Click out of that, save the file, and now at least I've got permission to access the internet. Without that, you'll get some nasty errors when you try and do so. Now I got to figure out, well, what it is I'm going to try and access. So up here at the top, I'm going to create a few constants. So the first one is I'm going to create a constant for my app ID. It's a string, and I'm going to call it the app ID. Now it's going to equal to something. What's it going to equal to? Well, that's going to be from here. Before we created this data, so I'm going to pull up this app ID. So I'm copying that, switch back over to here, and I'll paste it in. Again, this needs to be something that can be put into a URL and a GET request, because that's how we're going to access the data. Okay, so that's the app ID. I need to know where I'm going, so I need the server. And this is going to be the demo project. At appspot.com. Okay, and we know that that's the right one because again I can go back over here and that's the URL I've got here at the top. So again we're using the exact same interface, we're just going to be the client this time rather than the web browser. I need to know what file to access. And so this is going to be the query file. Is going to be xmlquery.cgi. And finally, I need to figure out what is my options. So create another constant for that. And for this, I need to know the syntax. So I'm going to put the question mark, and then the app ID equals, and then whatever my app ID is. So now I got all the parts. I need to build the full thing. Is going to be my server URL plus my query file plus my query options. Okay, so that's the sort of constants as to where I'm going. Now I know what data I'm going to try and load. All I need to do now is actually do so. So what I want to do is, let me just, I got some sample code here I'm following along through to make sure I get it right. I need to create some way of downloading the information. I could download that on the UI thread. The problem is this may lock up my UI. If the server's unavailable or it takes a long time to download the data, that can really mess up the interaction of your UI, and Android could then try and kill your app saying it's been unresponsive. So we don't want to do that. We're going to put this on the background thread. The easiest way to do that is to use an async task. So I'm going to create a new inner class. So this is going to be an inner class for doing background download. So it's a private inner class, and let's call it async downloader. It's going to extend, so extends the async task class. Now this is a generic, and it takes in 3 generics actually, but I'll get to that in just a second here. So the 3 generics are going to be the type of data we're going to pass the background downloader, the type of data we're going to get back from it, and what we're going to return as a result. So anyway, we'll just see how that works. So we're going to do an object, string, and integer as the class. Now we see here we got an error. Let me go that. If I go Control 1, we need to first import it. And we're not, incidentally, overriding all of the required functions. So I'm going to add implementation for the required overridden functions. And so it automatically fills it in. This object correlates to that object we put there. We're not actually going to use it in this demo, but we could use it in the future. So there's one other thing I want to show is that this is going to do the background downloading task. So when we create this, and we're going to start up our background downloader, this is actually going to happen in the background on a separate thread. Now when you got 2 threads, communication between the threads can be tricky. It turns out that this async task happens to do all that for us. So what I can do is I can override. So I'm going to go here, right click, and then sources, and then I want to override implement method, and I'm going to implement the onProgress update. Don't have to, but it actually is a very fantastic way of getting data out of it. So now I've got some sort of progress update. This one is going to be called back whenever we've got something new is completed. So we're going to kind of process data here. We're going to download the data here. So we've got the 2 parts in there. Let's start making it happen. So to begin with, what I want to do is I'm going to have this actually pull down the data. So I'm going to use an XML parser, XML pull parser. This is kind of handy because it'll actually do the HTTP query for me and download the XML data. So let's call this receive data equals, and I'm going to create a function I'm going to call try downloading XML data. I'm just going to set up the basic structure here, and then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to process it. Records found, process the actual XML, and generate some records. So we're going to come up with another function called try parsing XML data, and it's going to take in the received data, the XML pull parser that we just created, and in the end I'm going to then return the records found. Let's spell it right. So here I need to import the XML parser, and now it's not going to be happy because it doesn't know about these 2 functions. So I'm going to Control 1 and I'm going to implement them. as private methods inside this inner class. So this is breaking down my processing into smaller pieces. So first I need to actually get the data. So how am I going to do that? Well, I'm going to try, as the name of this function suggests. I'm going to try doing something because we're going to generate some exceptions. And let's give them up the URL. So the URL I'm going to actually access is the XML. Let's call it XML URL. And new URL. And I need to figure out where I'm going to query. Well, I just happen to have a query string already built. Query URL up above. That's the location we're going to try and download from. I'm going to come up with an XML parser, a pull parser. And receive data is equal to, now I'm not actually going to new anything, I'm going to use the factory to build me that. So XML pull parser factory I'm going to use, and I'm going to get a new instance. New instance, and then I say on this I'm going to call new pull parser. Okay, so that, what's going on here? I'm getting a factory, a new instance of it, and then I'm going to create a new pull parser. It replaces me trying to actually use new on the pull parser. They happen to have a factory that builds one for me. And then I'm going to take the received data. So received data. And on that, I'm going to set the input to the XML URL dot open stream. And so this is going to open the stream for me, start downloading, and null for the other option. So this is basically the processing. Return the received data. So the basics of this class, or basics of this method, is we're going to try and download the data. We create an XML URL. I try and create a puller for it. I then set the input stream for it and return it. I'm going to rename this, refactor it just to get the name right. Now the one other thing I need to do here is I need to handle a couple things. So I can handle what happens if it fails. So I need to set up some error handling on this. So I can catch a few things. There's a couple of exceptions that can be thrown. One is an XML pull parser exception. And we'll just do that. And the other one is a IO exception. General IO exception can be thrown by the URL. IO exception. Autocomplete that again. Now what to do with this exception once I've got it? Well, I don't want to just ignore it. But I don't want to handle it in any particular way, so I'm just going to log it. Log.e, and so I'm going to use the tag that I declared in my parent class. And let's have it here as the XML pull parser exception. And I can do e, passing it the throwable object to log. And then return null, saying that we failed. Okay, so that's a basic way of downloading. Now I need to actually do something with it. So I'm passed in so that's up here, we're going to call it. We get back the received data. Now I pass that in as an argument to my try parsing the data. So we come into here, we're going to parse the data. So how do I parse the data? I'm going to first check to make sure I got a good object. So if the received object is not equal to null, I'm going to do something interesting with it. Otherwise, I'm just going to return 0, indicating no records were processed. So I'm going to call. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to break this out into a separate function as well, just to handle my exceptions. So I've got some sample code here. I'm just going to copy and paste to save typing. So I'm going to call this new function I'm going to create, which is going to process the received data. Here we were trying it. Now I'm going to actually, this is the error handling. Now I'll actually process it. And then every time I got some sort of failure, I'm going to log it again as before. So now the interesting part is this function. So I'll control 1, create the method. And down here we actually are going to put in the data that we want to process. Okay, so what do I do here? I need to somehow process the XML. So the easy way to process the XML is to use this XML pull parser. I can pull from it. I can sort of iterate through all the different fields or all the different tags that are found in it. So get rid of that. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to copy and paste the code in because creation of the code isn't quite so interesting. Let's walk through and see what we have here. So I copied into the same function I had before. I create a couple integers. Records found. Let's start with that. That we're going to count up every time we find a record. We can see we count it up in the middle. And then I return it down here at the end. Don't need two return statements. So with the rest of this, I start off with an event type. This is going to be the data that I'm processing as we go through. Let me just move that down. So create the event type, and I also create a number of strings. This is going to be the data that I'm going to extract from my XML. So everything that's encoded in the XML is going into here. I'm going to come into here, and we're going to process it. So we've got a few problems here. We need to import the appropriate resource parsers, and this came in here as my previous function. Instead of receive data, we'll call it XML Data. So I'm going to go through a loop. What's the loop going to do here? Well, I'm going to keep looping as long as the event type that we're getting from the XML parser is not end documents. So we can kind of go to the next a bunch of times. We keep sort of cycling through the different tags and elements, and at some point the event we're going to get back is document end, or end document, meaning we've done all the data. So while we have data still, we're going to keep looping through. Based on the event type, we're going to pick one of three possibilities. If it's a start tag, I'm going to pull out some of the attributes. If it's a standard text, meaning it's not actually a tag, it's sort of data inside of it, I'm going to append that to data. And if it's the end tag, I'm going to process it. So let's get a feel for what we're actually working with. If I go back into my web browser and I go to my XML query page, this is what we actually need to parse. So we've got three attributes: the app ID, the timestamp, and the item ID. These are all attributes on the tag. The tag is named record. And we have here some text, plain text, inside of the tag. So what I need to do is I need to be able to process this. So this start is going to pull out those three attributes, get attribute value, and I set the data to be null, or to be an empty string, and then I'm going to go through all of the, if it's a plain text, I'm going to add it to here. Now this is a very simplistic way of doing it. If your data actually happened to be XML data that you'd uploaded, you're going to need a much more complicated XML processing structure. This is sufficient for us because we have only expected to have the data coming back as plain text. And then once I hit the end tag, I'm going to say I found a record, and I'm going to call publish progress. So that's an interesting thing we've got there. And what's going on here? It's going to throw. So I'm going to add a throws declaration to this, saying all the different exceptions that can be thrown, which we're catching elsewhere. Okay, so let's review where we're at. We have up here, do in background is going to start. It's going to download the data, and then it's going to call this try parsing XML data. So try parsing XML data, basically it checks to make sure we got a valid object, and then calls the process receive data, which is down here. In the process receive data, we're basically going to process the XML. I set up a few values that I'm going to kind of work through, and then I cycle through all of the different tags in my XML. Every time I find one, I call publish progress, which is part of the the async task we're working inside of. So that's going to generate a appropriate processing, and I can pass it any number of arguments here. So these are var args, and when I'm done, if I haven't found anything, I call publish progress with nothing, saying we haven't found any data. So where does this data go? Here I have 4 arguments, each of type string. It's got to go somewhere. Well, that's that whole on progress update that we saw earlier. This code is going to be executed anytime our background thread executes a publish progress. All of the arguments that we passed in above, either here with nothing or here with 4 arguments, that's going to come in as our values of our arg. So what do I want to do here? I want to do whatever processing I want to do on my data. Now this is on your main thread, so you can do anything you like here. So I can do a couple things. First off, let's check if we've got nothing. So if values dot, and there should be a size here, or length, pardon me. Yeah, length, because it's an array. If it's equal to 0, we don't have any data. So let's log it. Log.i, we're going to do the tag, and no data download. Okay, so that could be one thing. Now I can check, well, what if I get data? So I've got 4 strings coming in. So if values.length is equal to 4, I've got lots of data to process. So now I need to actually start pulling them out. And to save a bit of time, let me just copy over from my other project. I'm going to say the first one here we saw is the appid, so that's arg0. The second one is going to be item ID, so I'm naming it item ID. Now the names match here. That's just because they're good names both times. The names are completely independent of each other. They're just a variable. So we're creating a new variable here, and we're pulling it out of an array. And finally, I've got the timestamp. Now I can do anything I like with it, anything at all. So let's start off by logging it. So the log, again copied over, just 2 straight up log statements. First one, I'm going to put the app ID and the timestamp. This is going to be kind of long and uninteresting, so it's going to go on one line. Indented from that, I'm going to put on the second line the item ID here. So let's just prove that this works so far. Well, actually, if I were to run this, nothing's going to happen. I canceled that. Why? Because I haven't yet started it. So I got all this lovely processing. This whole async task, async downloader does all this work for me, but nobody actually does anything with it. So what I need to do is I need to go back up, and I need to do something with it. So in my query server, I need to actually start that. So how am I going to do that? Well, to do that, I'm going to create an instance of my async downloader. So async downloader, and let's call it downloader. Downloader equals new async downloader. No arguments required. And then to actually start it up, I need to call in the downloader.execute. I can pass in some parameters. These are objects. I'm not using any here, so I'm just going to skip that. If you wanted to make your async downloader very generic, you could pass in whatever you like. General objects, strings, records, whatever type of data you want. So now, when I click on this, we're going to see a log message for query server. In the background here, let's add a few more log messages. So down here, inside of trying the download, I'm going to say now processing, or now downloading. And then inside of my parsing algorithm here, well, every time we find data, we're going to call publish progress. And how about here, when we're done counting, I'm going to finished processing data. Now we just happen to have a count of how many elements we want, so finished processing, and I get the record count, records found, many records. And a lot of space here just to get it formatted. So let me run that. Control F11 after having saved it. It refreshes. So let's clear the display to start with. And when I click query, we should see, oh, it crashed. Well, let's figure out why. Why did it stop unexpectedly? So if I come back in here, I can look at the log cat. Let's look at all messages. So if I bring this up wider, we can look at this data here. So I've got this long trace of what's going on. We see query server now downloading, and then we had an exception. So runtime exception, an error occurred while executing do in background. Async task done, and we'll see if we can actually get some information on that. So this is all Android util. We don't care about. That's not what we wrote. What we wrote is way down here, the ca.background project viewer. So we've got sort of a trace as to where things went wrong. So if this is probably just where we're starting it. and we're trying the download. And here we see at OpenStream. So we had a problem at OpenStream on input. We were unable to connect. So let's do a couple things. Let's first off check we've got an internet connection on the emulator. So we try to go to Google. That works. Okay, so we got a Google connection there. Let me go back into my code and see where the code goes wrong. So we're going to try and process the XML opening the stream. It somehow doesn't want to adequately open the stream for us. So XML URL was created here, so that's our query string. Let's go back up and check to make sure that that actually is functioning correctly, is correctly formed. So we've got the http://demo. There's a typo. Double slash instead of single slash. Well, let's try that again. Come back in here. Watch it generate. Clear. I click query. And this time, we have data. Nothing came up here yet. That's next. Let's look in the logcat to see what happened. So here in the logcat, we've got the query in the server. We start now downloading. I say now downloading, we're going to get the app ID, the information, so we get the app ID and the timestamp, and then we get the data. So this is all of the data, so we got 101, 50, 500, and up, down. It's the exact same data that we saw here on the server side. 101, 50, 500, up, down, with all of the appropriate values. So hello world, early data, late data, and so forth. So that's great. We've actually got the real data from the server. So let's actually process it. Let's do something with it. Now to do that, I can do, again, anything I like. This is running on the main thread, so I can access UI elements or post data to a UI element. Let's make a function inside of our normal, not inside of the inner class, but inside of just our standard application here at the top. And let's say it's going to be a private void, and let's say handle new record. And at this point, I'm just going to care about the ID, so the string, the item ID, and the string for the data. The rest I could pass in if I wanted, but I don't really care about that. Maybe that's not interesting data to me. So then I'm going to do something with it, so let's build a string with that. String message is equal to item ID plus and data. So I'm just going to concatenate the two together in a little nice way and get the spelling right there. And then I'm going to put it on the screen. So I've got this UI element here, this UI element called DisplayData. I'm going to put it into there. So we're going to first find the text view, so it's a text view. I could type it all in again, but I happen to have all that code up here in my on-click clear display. So I'll bring that down. I now have the text view. I can say text view dot set text, and I can pass in the message. Now the challenge with this though is that the message is going to obliterate whatever it is I had before. So this is going to currently just overwrite it. So let's make this message a little smarter. I'm going to make it be whatever the text view dot set get message, get text dot, and here I happen to know I need to go to string on that, otherwise it gives me back some other data type. And I'm going to append to this a new line character. So what I'm doing, I'm taking the existing string and I'm going to append to it a little bit of extra information. Now I need to call this handle new record, so I'm going to go back all the way down to the bottom into my progress update, and here I'm going to pass it to the application. And we're going to pass in the item ID and the data. So now whenever I get data, we're going to grab the two pieces of information and pass it back. So we run that, Control F11, and hopefully this should complete the loop. Now when we query the server, it's going to download the new data and put it back all the way into the UI. Clear, and there we go. All four pieces of information that we're getting back. Let's prove that this is actually a live demo. Prove that it's really working. So here, I'm going to display all this data again. Let's add a new one. Let's call it value number 1. And yes, it works. Submit that to the server. We can see that it comes up here. And now when I go back into the application, query the server again, yes, it works, comes up. So what have we got? We have an Android application that queries the server and displays the answers it gets back to the UI. The way it does this is it uses a background downloader. So this happens off the main thread, so if it takes a long time, it's not going to be a problem. We've also put in the fact that we have here the check, so we get the information coming back from it when we process the XML data. We check for it being a no data, and we can do whatever we like here. We could clear the display, I could put up an error message on the screen, whatever I want is possible. It's just anything to handle my code. Alright, so that concludes this demo. Thank you for watching.